going to give this, we're just going to give this another 30 seconds or so for people to file in. But first, I'd like to say thank you for taking an afternoon off in what is probably the nicest day of the year so far. I think you should all be really proud of yourselves. I can see my neighbours enjoying the garden when I'm sat inside talking about digital infrastructure and process, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. It's 1 minute past, so I'm going to make a start on this session, which is on digital leadership, infrastructure and process. I'm Adam Koszary, I'm head of digital at the Audience Agency, and I'll be chairing the session. I'm a white male wearing a headset and microphone with a brown hair comb over, wearing a stripy top in a room. I think I'll go for that. Some housekeeping rules for this session. So we're going until 4:30 this afternoon. I'd ask if you could change your Zoom name to show both your personal name and your organisation name, because it's very helpful for us to know who's in the room and where your experiences are coming from. We are already recording the session and we'll be sharing it, but what we share will only show the speakers, it won't show anyone else in the room, so you don't need to worry about that. During the session, please use the chat to leave any comments. We'll be throwing some links in there to whatever's relevant as it comes up to, and please use the Q&A function, and also to upvote any questions you see in there which you feel you would also like answered, or choose the most popular to answer at the end. You can also switch on live transcripts at the bottom of the screen with the CC live transcript button. And not the nicest day of the year in Glasgow. I'm down south from Reading, but I think it's meant to be nice in Scotland tomorrow. To introduce the session properly, so this is a Digital Skills for Heritage and National Lottery Heritage funded event. It's the third of 6 in a series called Leading the Sector 2020-2022, which runs from March to September 2022. Each session focuses on a different aspect of digital challenge, change, or opportunity that leaders of heritage organisations need to consider and act upon as we all move forward from COVID-19's digital kickstart. So what we're doing in this session is you'll be hearing from me for about another 7 or so minutes as I introduce the topics of today. We'll then hear from both of our speakers, and then we'll have about half an hour of Q&A to finish. And our speakers today are exploring why this kind of behind the scenes element of digital maturity is so vital in meeting your organisation's aims and objectives, and what you as leaders need to be doing about it. Our speakers are Jack Kirby, Associate Director of Collection Services for the Science Museum Group, and he'll be showing us how transforming processes in digital infrastructure and ways of working helped with the challenges and opportunities of moving the Science Museum collections out of Lifehouse and into their new centre. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Lauren Vargas, who has over 20 years of experience assisting organisations with their community, communication and collaboration strategies. And she'll be exploring how emotional intelligence is key to achieving digital maturity using her calm approach. But first, to set the scene and introduce the themes of today. As someone who's worked in galleries, libraries, archives and museums, just one type of heritage that we're talking about today, I've been on the receiving end of digital transformation strategies, as well as implementing a couple myself, and now in my role at the Audience Agency, helping organisations with their own journeys of digital maturity and transformation. But whatever heritage form you're involved with, the principles more or less stay the same. And there are two things which always seem to come up for me. One is leadership, and particularly how leaders can see the wood from the trees, because digital conjures up so much in people's minds and hits on so many areas. We often get down into the weeds when actually we need that wider view. But also how you become digitally literate enough as a leader to make good decisions, but also to trust others to make those decisions, to be literate enough to understand why they're making those decisions and have that delegation. But then there's also the adaptability, mindsets and approach to digital work, which often requires adapting to changing circumstances, constant evaluation and iteration. But to dig into leadership just a little bit more, because I've encountered a lot of leaders who, when it comes to digital, are quite happy to leave it to the experts. And you may have encountered some of these similar views on your board, in your executive team. You may even hold them yourselves. But disengaging from the process will only get you so far, as digital data and technology increasingly underpinning how we work, how we're achieving our missions, and how we're innovating. And it's at all levels of, because it's at all levels of the organization, impacts all levels of the organization, it's very easy to get messy very fast. And it's easier just to say, I'll leave it to the experts. But it does need leadership. And I think this was most evident during the pandemic, when we all had to fall back on digital means for doing our jobs. And suddenly a lot of organizations realized they lacked the digital infrastructure, whether that was technical or in terms of processes, in order to just do their jobs purely digitally. And a lot of leaders assume that getting a handle on all of this digital work means they need to learn how to do things. Like most people have that fear of, when they hear digital skills, they think they're going to be told how to use Twitter in their job. But what leaders need isn't necessarily digital capability, but literacy. They need to understand what digital can achieve and give it that strategic direction, to understand its implications and how to fit it into the whole of the organization. And this isn't done from an ivory tower, but Lara later will be going into what that kind of leadership looks like in her talk. And equally, infrastructure and process may seem boring, but it's what you need to build innovation on top of. Foundations, whether that's in your systems, skills, ways of working, your standard ways of doing things, they're about giving people the tools to do their jobs, but also remove doubts about how things are done. Example I always come back to in my own work is, you may or may not know, at some point in my career, I made a viral tweet about a big sheep when I was working at the Museum of English Rural Life, called the Absolute Unit tweet. And that tweet would not have been possible had we not fixed the digital infrastructure and foundations of how we used our collections. If things had still been stuck on a shelf, requiring me to go to the shelf, take a picture of that photo and upload it, I would just never have done that. But there'd been a year-long process of digitizing those photographs, but also realizing that wasn't enough, and creating a digital asset management system so that those digitized photos could be available to all staff, but also being literate enough to understand that not everyone understands copyright law. Some collections are more ethical to share online than others. So making a policy of our archive team to rope off and designate certain areas of the collection as copyright-free, and being able to use them on social media, whereas everything else was closed off. All of those infrastructural foundations led to being able to take that picture very easily, know that we could use it on social media and use it in a way that we saw best based on our digital marketing skills. So while you can see the tip of the iceberg of a viral tweet, beneath that are layers of foundational work, not just in terms of technical systems, but how we use those systems in the context of our work. Now, one way it can seem overwhelming to be figuring out all of these different areas and impacts on our work, because the possibilities are so many. But that's where tools such as the Digital Culture Compass, say, for Arts Council England come in. They give you a framework for understanding where you are now and where you would like to be, and scoring those different areas of your organization according to digital maturity, from initial to transforming. And it's not just what would you consider the classically digital parts of your organization. It's your collections, your public program, your IT, yes, but also your HR, your enterprise, trying to figure out how digital affects all of these areas. And it's great because it gives you a structure, and it's designed to be collaborative. It's not done in isolation with just the experts. It's done with people around the table from across your organization at all levels, talking it through. It's about examining where you are now, where you want to be, and how to take incremental steps to getting to where you want to be. What things need fixing? Where do you need a policy? Where are your skills gaps? Where is the best place to apply resource? And that usually brings you on to conversations about digital transformation, which is a kind of scary phrase and word. But digital transformation is only possible in some areas. Sometimes it's getting a grip on legal compliance. It's not particularly transformational, but it is very important. But you may also be reviewing your infrastructure in the context of a longer-term transformational goal, such as, say, if you hold a lot of data, becoming a data institution, so publishing and managing your data very publicly. It all depends on the context of your organization. We often talk about digital transformation as being like the Joker in a pack of cards. You can only play it once. And tools like Digital Culture Compass can help you focus in on where you can have the most impact, and then bring everything else up just to a level where it works well enough, depending on your resource. I think what our speakers are also going to hit on today is this idea that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Digital work, digital transformation, digital culture are never finished. And actually, a lot of it is about your mindset. There's no one size fits all approach. And digitally literate leadership and a culture of curiosity are actually key in facing the changing demands of what digital throws at us as leaders. Which brings us on to our first talk. So I'm very happy to introduce Jack Kirby from the Science Museum Group, who's going to give a full introduction of himself and his talk.
Thank you, Adam. And Adam, can you just confirm that you can hear me okay and see me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Fabulous. I'm Jack Kirby. As Adam said, I'm Associate Director of Collection Services for the Science Museum Group. I am a bald, middle-aged white man in a blue shirt with a flowery pattern on it. I'm wearing glasses and hearing aids, which are probably obscured by the headset that I'm wearing. I will share my screen so that you don't have to look at me for much longer. Bear with me a moment. And hopefully you will now have the slides. So in this talk, I'm going to cover some things that we've done, but just a bit about me first. So I kind of have worked through my way through larger organisations through my career. So I started off very small at the Ragged School Museum in East London, a small independent. I worked for a local authority museum for a year in Greenwich. I worked in Birmingham for several years at think tank, the Birmingham Science Museum, which is now part of Birmingham Museums Trust. And then in 2012, I joined the Science Museum Group based here in Manchester, initially as head of collections for our museum, the Science and Industry Museum here in Manchester, but then subsequently since 2015 as first group head of collection services and now associate director of collection services. And I guess on this journey, I found actually the needs of large and small organizations are not that dissimilar, really. It's just about scale and budgets. So I think whatever the scale, whatever your budget, there will be hopefully things that are transferable from this talk, and whatever kind of your organization you're in, whatever kind of heritage or other culture that you deal with. And so this is, I guess I don't inherently think of myself as a digital leader, but if you look at my career, effectively I have been. So I'm going to talk about just one of our projects, but I could have talked about a whole range of different things. If I just say a tiny bit more about my approach, I think it's overall, I look for ways to innovate and have impact. And I think about what skills do I already have in the organization, as well as what new skills might I need to bring in from outside. And I guess I've spent time exploring and understanding just enough to ask the right questions and understand the answers. And so I wouldn't claim to be a digital expert, but I kind of know enough to know who to ask and what to ask them. And maybe that's all you actually do need. In terms of what I'm going to talk about, just a brief introduction to the Science Museum Group. So we are an English National Museum Group, but we do work closely with our counterparts in the other nations as well. And we have 5 museums. I'm here in the middle in Manchester. We've also got museums in York, County Durham, Bradford, Science Museum in London, and then the National Collection Centre in Wiltshire. And we have around 5 million visitors a year in typical years before the pandemic to our museums, but even more increasingly online, which is important as well. And I was appointed to my current role, and the digital director, John Stack, who I work quite closely with, was appointed to his role at the same time in 2015. And each of us produced a strategy which we took to our Board of Trustees in December that year. And I just want to draw out the points that I've highlighted in red here. I'm not going to bore you with all of our strategies, which were quite organisation specific, but the transferable bits are useful. So in terms of digital strategy, we knew that digital wasn't something that sat in a department or a team. It needed to be an organisation-wide endeavour. We had our heritage, our collection, up front in what we wanted to achieve with digital. So providing access, but recognising that that front end of access needs a back end as well. It needed investment in infrastructure, as well as things like our user interface. And we were also very keen on open access and making sure that what we were doing would be as open as possible. And so that was foundational to what we were trying to achieve as well. And the technical infrastructure underlying all of that is where we've made quite a bit of investment, but driven by projects that we were doing. So we didn't go out and say, we want to invest in the digital infrastructure. We said, we're going to do this thing and we need digital investment to help us achieve it. And then on my side, the collection services strategy, we had, as I'll demonstrate in the talk, I hope, quite an old-fashioned approach to how we were doing things. It was still very paper-based. And so part of my strategy was just about let's use technology better, and we can, there are other benefits as well as efficiency that come from that. It can help us to improve our accountability for the national collection. And let's also not try and do it all at once. So the project I'm talking about today, we're only now, having delivered it a few years later, starting to roll out some of it into our business as usual processes, because changing everything at once would have been too disruptive. But having those strategies in place was also important, because it meant that subsequently later, when we did come to ask for investment, we were able to point back and say, well, the board signed this off, and therefore it's the investment that we're asking for absolutely fits with what we said strategically we were going to try and achieve. So on to the project that I want to tell you about. And this project was a challenge that became an opportunity. It was interesting when Adam said digital transformation can be scary. My reaction to that is, well, it can be exciting too. And actually, if you try and think of the positives rather than the challenges, then you can build a vision that people will buy into. And so our challenge was Blythe House, which you see here in the central photograph. This is a building in West Kensington in London, which houses around, or did house until very recently, around 280,000 of the Science Museum Group's objects. And it's also shared with the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. And in 2015, the government announced that they were going to sell this building, and in our case, we would need to move everything to the National Collection Centre, to a new building, which is just outside Swindon. And the challenge was that we didn't have a complete idea of what we had in our collection. So we knew that at least a third of the objects in this building weren't on our digital catalogue, our existing catalogue. We knew that we didn't have great data about where all of them were. They are full of hazards. You can see on the right-hand side, we have lots of very exciting hazards in the Science Museum Group collection: radiation, asbestos, mercury, all the kind of things that you don't want in your home. And only about 5% of them were photographed and online with an image. So I saw this as a massive opportunity to sort this out. If we're going to have to move everything anyway, let's look at how we can do that in the most efficient way possible and make some improvements along the way. And I started out by looking at how our teams were working on the ground. And this slide here is probably the most important one, because what I went in there with was a fundamentally curious approach. These questions you could apply to any organisation, not just even heritage organisations. So I spent time with the teams who were on the floor doing work and talking about how they worked. And I found that things hadn't really moved on very much since I'd entered the sector around the millennium. We were still doing quite repetitive tasks very manually, walking around stores with clipboards, writing things down on the clipboard, going to a room that had a static PC in it, entering data, probably getting some of it wrong in doing that double entry in effect. And we weren't making any use of portable technology, and our staff's skilled time was instead being spent sort of re-entering data that they'd already captured manually in the store. And this didn't seem like the most profitable way forward, given that by 2015, pretty much everybody had a smartphone. And I thought my people are using handheld technology in every aspect of their lives except at work. And so thinking about how we could do it differently was quite key to having the first ideas about what we subsequently did. And I then looked beyond my own organisation. I think this is always a really good thing to do. Who is doing interesting work in the museums, libraries, archives, kind of sectors, heritage sector, but equally who's doing interesting things in other sectors. So find the interesting people, talk to them about what they are doing, and look for things that we could emulate, and equally beyond the museum and heritage sort of sectors, what is the commercial industry doing and what could we learn from that? So it might seem completely different, but actually when you start to look at the logistics of how we all receive parcel deliveries during the pandemic, there's lots of similarities. You need to know what you've got. You need to know where it is. You're going to need to package it up and send it off somewhere. And if you look at how those kind of industries work, that was where we started to get the idea of using barcodes with our database, because actually every package you get from Amazon or whoever comes with at least one and probably multiple barcodes on it. So we were looking around and saying, who else out there is doing interesting things within the sector? People like libraries were doing things that were ahead of what museums were doing as well. So we were looking for those kind of precedents that we could then adapt, and an emphasis particularly for behind the scenes work on stable technology, because you don't necessarily need everything to be whizzy and innovative. You just want something that's got longevity. And we were thinking about how could what we were doing for this project also feed into our long-term work. So what we came up with then was technology-driven workflows. So effectively systematizing previously quite not very written down processes sometimes, and making them things that you could use with barcodes, with barcode scanners as seen here, that linked into our existing database. We weren't going to try and reconstruct everything from scratch. That was too big an ask. And how we could effectively speed up what the teams were doing and make their jobs therefore focused on the bits that only people could provide, the identification of objects, or the detailed condition checking that conservators need to do, for example. So we effectively invested in both the hardware, the kind of handheld and portable devices, Wi-Fi, and then some behind the scenes quite neat technical stuff to connect things up. And this resulted in a production line approach and meant that we have an accurate location for all our objects at all times, and that gets updated by scanning the barcode. And what this fundamentally meant was less time spent on each object. And so when I came to make the case for investing in this, because it wasn't cheap, it has to be said, but we needed to move everything anyway, and I was able to demonstrate that the upfront cost of all the investment that we were making, which was people as well as the technology, would result in, firstly, a more efficient process of delivery. Secondly, management benefits. So you can see here one of our dashboard reports, so that we have an accurate idea of where we're up to, which we never used to in the old days. We only knew physically that we'd cleared a particular room. We couldn't really see it in data terms, what we were doing. And then a massive public benefit as well, because we've been able to put the collection online, which we just didn't have at any scale before. And so I used a series of slides like this to sell this to our program board for the project and demonstrate that we'd gone, for example, with our inventory process, by making it digital, we'd gone from 15 minutes per object to 4 minutes per object, which when you needed to inventory over 100,000 objects became a very good investment. And in spite of all those logical arguments, actually what really sold this was the photography. And this was a good example of giving people a brief, but also letting them run with it. So the team were asked to come up with photographs of each object, and we had a brief for a fairly basic quality image, but they managed to find a fantastic way of having small portable light tents, portable cameras, portable lighting, which for not that much investment, frankly, in the actual technology, enabled us to capture fabulous images. So we've gone from 5% to 35% of our collection online in over 2 years. We're aiming for over 50% by the time we finish the project. And that's been seen by 2 million people since January 2021 alone, and over 5 million people since it launched in late 2016. So out of some behind the scenes improvements, we've also managed to create the world's greatest science and technology collection online. So lessons learned, of course, it's not all straightforward. I guess bringing in data management skills that we didn't have before was important. The letting people run with things, as I said, was a real success story. Don't necessarily feel that you need to constrain them and make them stick to the original scope, piloting things on the ground, and inevitably not all the tech worked all the time, but we were able to devise workarounds, and we've got lessons learned next time we start another project of this kind of scale. So finally, just some reflections. I've talked very specifically about one of our projects, but as I said, I think this could apply to anything. Be curious, bring together people with the right skills, give them a clear brief, steer the development, and then use project funding, which is often easier to get than core funding, to drive innovation, gain investment, and use the benefits that you could get in terms of efficiency, accountability, and legacy to justify that. So thank you very much, and I will pass back to Adam.
Jack. If you have any questions for Jack, please put them in the Q&A and we will get around to them after we hear from Lauren. But I feel like I can't really add too much onto Jack's conclusions there, but a few things did jump out at me. The idea of not trying to do everything all at once, I think, goes back to that idea of transformational patience. You have the brief, you know where you're trying to get to, but you're not trying to transform the entire world. You're just starting with what you can change. The importance of having those strategies in place for getting future funding and future projects signed off as well, I think is really key. Agreeing that approach and following through. And I've seen that in a lot of organizations and people kind of thrashing about blindly and not having a clear steer on where they're trying to go and what they're trying to achieve. Getting that agreed in the first place cuts out a lot of the pain of just knowing whether you're doing the right thing and that's agreed by everyone around you. And at the end there, it's a small point, but that provision of data being incredibly helpful in making decisions. So very often, if you're trying to convince others and get new funding, visualizing what can often be quite a transient thing requires that both the collection of data and that visualization of data, as Jack said before, didn't even exist. But I've seen repeated in many other organizations. But now we're going to hear from Lauren. it away.
All right, hello. Joining from the Netherlands. So visual description before I start sharing my slides. Middle-aged Latina woman wearing glasses with reddish purple hair, intentionally wearing a Keep Calm t-shirt and seated in front of a bookcase. So let's get started. Share my screen. There we go. Excellent. All right, so just a bit about me so that you also understand how I approach digital. So for the first 18 years or so of my career, I've spent as both a practitioner participating in and leading large-scale digital transformations across highly regulated industries and companies like Aetna Health Insurance, Fidelity Investments, Salesforce, Radian6, and I cut my teeth in the U.S. Department of Defense. So I understand regulated industry, and I understand working within constraints. Now, if it might seem like I've worked on projects that have large teams or large budgets, let me clarify, that has not always been the case. In many instances, especially in the beginning, in each and every single one of those positions and every single one of those organizations, it started out with me, myself, and my multiple personalities creating and making a case for change and working through digital transformation in a very iterative way, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing spectacularly. Throughout the same period that I was within these organizations, I was also in school, either as a student, completing 2 master's degrees, a PhD, going to law school, all within the realm of better understanding communication and collaboration as enabled by digital, as well as being a teacher. You know, how I could learn more about theory and be able to test that theory in real-time applications. So in 2018, I left the private sector to move into working primarily with cultural and heritage organizations. And I started off by, as an independent researcher and consultant. And I really wanted to move into this sector because I wanted to do more than contribute to the bottom line. I'm also, since 2018, a researcher as part of the 1x1 project, which many of you may be familiar with. I was working on this project when I was based in the UK, as well as now when I'm based in the Netherlands. 1x1 is a multi-partner international initiative led by the University of Leicester School of Museum Studies, bringing together cultural organizations, policymakers, academics, professional bodies, support agencies, and communities of practice to build digitally confident museums. Now, before I begin, one question that I always get is, what is the difference between digital work in the private sector and that of cultural and heritage organizations? And while I'm sure a lot of you in the audience can rattle, a list of differences, I actually find that there's more in common. Why? Because we're dealing with humans working with other humans, and what it means to grapple with and harness the power of community to exact right-sized change. Now, I think we can all agree that digital is important. It's important for us to understand how we make sense of digital, how we manage digital, how we create digital within our own organization contexts and conditions. What's true is that digital is permeating every single role and responsibility across our organizations. Just think about how we communicate and collaborate, the various different types of technologies, whether they be digital first, like email or text or a forum-based message system, or digitally augmented, like we're gathered here today, where we're aided by voice and video. What's true is that we are actively shaping and being shaped by digital simultaneously. And even when we think that we aren't making any type of change or concerted effort when it comes to digital, that's actually not the case, because digital, the way in which we are interacting with or being shaped by digital is continuous. There is nothing static. Just think about, even if you haven't changed a specific system in eons, you're still coming up with different workarounds in how to use it, or different applications, or how it interfaces with other elements of your digital ecosystem. I think we often get scared by digital in thinking about the complexity of how digital is shaping us, and we are shaping digital as individuals, departments, organizations, collectives. And I think that we often confuse complexity with being complicated. We can't engineer the complexity out of the systems that we exist in. We are by nature navigating highly complex systems. What we can do is we can make it less complicated to navigate and to make sense of. In the words of my organizational design and development colleague, Dr. Sharon Varney, she states, if we focus on whether change should be planned or emergent, we are likely to miss how change is both planned and emergent. Wrong direction there. So what do we need to consider before we start thinking about the different skills and abilities that will enable us to enact the type of intentional change that we're talking about today? So first, we need to understand that we cannot exercise digital skills without having an understanding of how they align to our strategic goals and objectives. We can't better understand, train, perform, develop digital skills without having that understanding of the emotionality that is influencing those different efforts. We need to be able to combine our business and cognitive skills with emotional skills that give greater nuance or clarity and a robustness to our digital skills. Meaning, it's not simply just answering a tweet. It's knowing how we can read between the lines. Reading is the new listening when it comes to digital. We have to figure out different ways in which we interpret and understand digital language, whether it's happening in a digital first or a digitally augmented environment. In a survey of 1,500 executives across 90 different countries, a survey that was a set of research that was just published recently in the MIT Management Sloan, the trait of adaptability was one of the most important leadership qualities, alongside curiosity, creativity, and comfort with ambiguity when it came to digital, when leading in a digital age. We need to think beyond what's technically possible and really hone in on what are the needs, challenges, and desires of our workforce and the communities that we serve. We need to even push beyond that and start asking, is it morally, ethically, or sustainably the right direction, the right use, and the right technology? How is digital enabling or furthering our strategic goals and objectives? So this leads us to the take care to become approach. And as I stated, I'm a product of the Department of Defense, so I am a fan of a good acronym. We're going to be focused on the COM aspect of this particular framework, but the battle scars that I've acquired both as a practitioner, leader, student, now researcher, has led me to the formation of the take care to become approach. It's a life-centered framework to develop fit-for-purpose digital mindsets, skill sets, and tool sets, to rethink new ways of working, reimagine digital ecosystems, and reframe digital practices and processes. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to introduce you to the COM aspect of the framework. So before we can collaborate, we need to first learn how to communicate. When we're talking about digital efforts, and especially thinking about our own specific organizational contexts or conditions, when we talk about innovation and transformation, it's not necessarily those big sector wins where you have to be the shiny example of what digital looks and feels like. Something transformative or innovative for your organization might be being able to digitize workflows. It might be enabling a customer relationship management database. It could be something small that has a massive impact for your internal and external communities. And we have to move beyond, to achieve that communication and collaboration, we have to move beyond cooperation and really think about how we are enabling the skills, the abilities, the talents of our communities, both internally and externally. And so what does this mean? This means we really need to live into our commitment. Commitment comes before communication and collaboration. We need to think about how our aspirations, how our values are being lived in throughout our digital work, throughout our digital interactions, throughout our digital planning and processes. We need to think about how we're accountable to ourselves and to our communities in the digital space. We need to think about those unintended and intended consequences, and to establish an environment that enables communication and collaboration. We need to have some boundaries or some agreements about how we work. The rules of engagement inside and outside for how we handle and enable healthy conflict and ensure that multiple perspectives are considered. These rules help preserve the ability to collaborate, to learn through trial and error, and to really integrate what we learn through the process into the next round of decision-making. We need to lead by being open and transparent. Now, that doesn't mean we have to share everything under the sun. What it does mean is we need to act as a guide. We need to be able to showcase why and how decisions are being made. We need to move beyond if only we had X. We have to work with what we have. One of the things that I find when walking into any organization is one of the things hindering communication and collaboration, or really upsetting the organization and creating levels of tension or unhealthy conflict, is because there is no documented organizational memory. The insight and awareness of what has come before and what exists. How were those decisions made? Why did we choose to bring in this technology? What's the process for using this technology? What are the right practices? What are the governing principles of how we manage, use, understand, and create using this tool, platform, or system? So we have to develop some common ground before we can communicate and collaborate. And that's done by establishing some constraints. The next aspect of the Care to Be Calm framework is moving from being able to adapt to change and really flexing our anticipatory muscles or skills. Now, to do that, we don't necessarily always need a vision. Innovation doesn't come from a vision first approach. We don't always necessarily know what is going to happen. But if we are rallying around in community with some type of common purpose, that is helping us progress together. So purpose, not the leader, not authority or power, is what creates and animates community efforts. There's this false notion that ideas and innovation just spring fully formed from an individual's mind, and that's not so. It's really a group effort, a team sport. It's iterative, it's data informed. And when we're acting as a community to enact this particular change, it's more like a jazz band. We've got some constraints, but we're improvising. We're playing off of each other's beats. We're trying to figure out, who has this particular skill? How do we amplify that? How do we amplify that strength? How do we recognize this particular weakness and level out? We need to also understand that we might have these big, wonderful, audacious, hairy goals that are part of our purpose, but we have to learn by doing, and how we're learning from each other's beats means that we think big and act small. How do we take those iterative efforts? How do we work? How do we plan? How do we review together in sprints? How do we work smarter, not harder? So being able to work in that type of community requires creative agility, creative abrasion, and creative resolution. So what does that mean? That means creative agility. It's that organizational ability to test and refine ideas in quick experiments, reflect and then adjust, right? You keep learning, you keep trying and seeing what works, what doesn't work. Creative resolution is the organizational ability to be able to learn from those insights, to learn from that trial and error, and be able to impact our decision-making processes as we move forward. Creative resolution is when we move beyond groupthink, we move beyond a binary decision where we have to choose between A or B. And we look at the multiple solutions or the multiple perspectives that are part of this community and change effort. And we think about, how can we think of and combine multiple solutions, multiple perspectives? So leaders should be asking multiple questions. They should be probing, not providing all of the answers. If we were providing all of the answers, why would we need this particular group effort and this type of process of exploration? So a leader's role is to ask questions like, what about, what if, when, why? Encourage individuals and groups to really test ideas and reflect on what they're learning, and being more rigorous about the analysis and the collection of data. And it really helps us to, as leaders, not everybody might see the entire system. So we need to be able to see that entire system and make sense of that system for all of the different players that are involved. And this means that we need to let go of that heroic savior complex of leadership, where we need to embrace collective leadership and let go of command and control models. One of the things that creates a high sense of tension and conflict, and not the healthy kind, because tension and conflict are good. We don't want to engineer those out, because then we end up with stale ideas that are not robust or diverse in their perspectives. But one of the things that I find is that we have little clarity on who is responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted and informed, and how those roles change over time at multiple phases and stages of our process, of our project. So it's really thinking about how that innovation or that renovation goes beyond an individual effort or skill. We have discussions on a regular basis about, what does done look like? What does success look like? Are we clear on what that done looks like from one aspect of the project to the next? Now, a leader's job isn't necessarily to always have the answers and to be able to say, you know what, I don't have the answers. Let's figure out what multiple answers or multiple perspectives we need. It's also not to shut down the conversation and move to one solution, one area of thinking, while not keeping those various options on the table throughout the duration of the project or the effort. It's also ensuring that those multiple voices, that those unheard voices, those dissenting voices are having a seat at the table or a part of the process as you move forward with any digital effort. And last, but definitely not least, we need to be more mindful in our approach to digital. This means we have to really flex our empathetic skills. We move at the speed of trust. It's not how great our practices and processes or our digital ecosystem is. It's about what humans do and act and form a relationship with one another. So what does this mean for us? This means we need to establish some type of rhythm and develop rituals for us to plan, for us to review and showcase our work, to have retrospectives where we are inviting people in at consistent frequent meetings or exchanges of ideas, soliciting that feedback so that we can be really reflective and build something or create something or analyze something so that we're capturing those multiple perspectives, we're capturing those multiple views. What's important to understand about having a more mindful approach to digital is that possible solutions, as I said, don't just spring from thin air. They come from a series of sparks, how a group plays off of one another, how their contribution, one individual's contribution, is inspiring another individual or group's contribution. Now, we should be engineering creative abrasion into our digital work. Now, what does that mean? That means that we are including and actively spearheading, enabling ongoing discussion, evaluation, critical comparison of ideas. This is not to be confused with brainstorming, folks. Brainstorming is when we, create a bunch of ideas and we don't say anything critical. Creative abrasion, on the other hand, is supported by thoughtful confrontation, thoughtful consideration, and that ongoing discussion, that ongoing discourse. And that's why it only works if you set the stage for your community to really understand and live into their values, understand and progress with purpose, and be able to ensure that they can handle conflict within the group, within the community. And they use that conflict not as a barrier to change, but enacting change. It's a leader's role to really provide that purpose, those values, those rules of engagement, to set the scene for how people engage with one another so that they can bring their different skills, their different knowledge, their working styles and preferences in different ways in which they gather and process information or assimilate ideas. How might you be able to enact or enable that context for taking a more calm, reflective approach to digital? For your convenience, I have given you this little bit.ly link, Calm Prompts, that has all the different types of questions that I usually use when working with an organization to think through all of those elements of the Care to Be Calm framework. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Lauren. That's incredible. I was actually horrified at kind of very poorly organized thoughts that I've had on some of the topics into a really clear approach, which I wish I could print off and wrap around a brick and throw through certain old managers that I've had in the past through their windows. I feel like what we're seeing here is an approach to leadership by Lauren. And I think we've actually seen that many of its elements at least put into practice in how Jack has run his project at the Science Museum. I think it's clear that leadership isn't a paint by numbers. It's about fulfilling a role. So rather than not just ticking off this checklist of how to be a digital leader, it's all about how you create this right environment and playing that role of leader, challenger, and organizing that purpose. Because digital, I think in all of this, it's worth remembering the reason why all of this has been kicked off. It's because digital is going to become the natural answer to a lot of the questions you ask as a leader of an organization. I think Lauren put it really well by saying, think beyond what's technically possible and focus on the needs, wants, and desires of your users and staff. Learning that requires a calm approach. You can see how Jack approaches projects with a very curious mind, by going to the floor, talking to colleagues, creating that environment of curiosity, asking those right questions, and then using his own digital literacy to identify what gets them from A to B, how to identify the inefficiencies, how to fix them using digital where it makes sense, not just for the sake of it. And then also quite critically, communicating that data and understanding Lauren's point about who's responsible, accountable, who needs to be consulted and informed, making sure you're thinking in that very holistic way. I might take it back to the audience agency that we should become a jazz band, but I'm not quite sure how everyone in my team will think that we should be playing like a jazz band. maybe an orchestra. They don't really play off each other though, do they? It's more like a waterfall technique. I'm going to abandon that line of thought. If you have questions for what Lauren has talked about, please put them in the Q&A. But to begin with, I'm going to bring back in to go through some of these quite specific questions that we've had in the Q&A. But maybe from these, Jack, you could expand into areas. Yeah, see how we go. So the first one is from Rohan Jaskira. What software did you use to get the dashboard record tracking the move?
So this is a good example of where we haven't gone all the way with digital. What would be lovely, there's a Microsoft thing called Power BI where you can produce really amazing live data visualizations of your data. Transport for London use it to show how busy tube stations are and where there's cycle docks and that kind of thing. I would love to say we'd done that, but we didn't need to. And that what we've got is effectively a semi-automated process, so that data comes out of our systems and we pull it off on a weekly basis into spreadsheets, which are then translated into graphs which go onto a PowerPoint for monthly reports. So we see figures weekly and we see those nice reports like I was showing you monthly, and that's good enough. We could have invested further. If we were doing a commercial activity, you almost certainly would want real-time data reporting on it, but we didn't need that for our project. So it was an example of, let's go so far, let's make it visual. This is still 1,000 times better than we had before, which was me asking the conservation manager, so how's it going? So we've got data, we are using it, but we didn't actually go the full automated way with it.
Working on a project with an organization who are in a similar kind of position, they have a ton of data. They know they need to communicate it and visualize it so the people above them can make proper decisions. But they waste so much time in a manual, taking things from one spreadsheet to another, combining it all together, that they've now put into their strategy to try and figure out Power BI. It's like, we know it's going to, it takes an investment, it's going to take time, but in future that's going to save us so much more time and probably convince people better by making the graphs a bit jazzier too. The second question, oh, sorry, you're going to say something, Joe? No. Was the entire budget signed off in one go? And was budget threatened by the pandemic, or had it been completed before then?
So the budget, we released it in stages basically because we were also up against a deadline. So like most organizations, we have a process of going through, large organizations anyway, through funding gateways where you get some money up front to start developing your project, and then you go back when you've got more cost certainty. So it was a bit like that. We brought on a small team to start off with, and then we scaled up when we were a bit further along the line. But we were driven also by a deadline of needing to vacate this building so that the government could sell it. So there was always that at the back of our minds. We couldn't wait around to develop the perfect solution. So in terms of the pandemic, it slowed us down. We obviously ground to a halt like everybody else for the first couple of months. And then after that, because we were working in confined museum stores with no ventilation systems, we had very limited numbers of staff able to work in the space at once, which slowed us down. So it ended up costing us more. Was it in doubt? Not really, because of the bigger set of circumstances surrounding the project, but also because as we went into the project, suddenly it became quite superb that we had spent the last couple of years digitizing everything, or digitizing a proportion of the collection. Our curators, by now making the rapid transition to working from home, were able to see the objects despite the fact they could no longer physically access them. And our audiences online were growing very rapidly in those first months. And we were able to use that content in our social media and in other work that we did all over the Science Museum group. So actually, if anything, it really justified the investment that we had made as well. I think you can't, if you get the infrastructure right, it will repay you in ways you haven't foreseen, as well as the ways that you had planned.
I think there's a recent story about the Natural History Museum. It made X amount of millions of pounds from its digitized collections, or it digitized its millionth thing or something. I think that made the international press, and DCMS thought it was a great thing, even though DCMS hadn't actually done anything to encourage it. The Natural History Museum had just done it themselves. But yeah, that's almost the point I was saying at the very beginning of infrastructure, making these opportunities available, whereas before they just wouldn't have been. So you're completing your projects, but also then creating the conditions for things to be built on top of this infrastructure. Something else you said, I'd like to come back to that point. We'll just get through these next two. Richard Hall has asked if there's any viable alternative to modes, and that's a specific type of software, isn't it?
Quite specific to museums. So a lot of smaller museums use a piece of software called Modes, which has a lot of virtues, I would say, because it's really simple, which if you're in a small organization without tech support is to be valued. I can't. There are pros and cons to all software. What I would say about Modes is you don't have to do everything in it, even if you're still using it. So it has a great affordability advantage for small organizations as well as the tech support. But it has perfectly good import capabilities via CSV and so on. So you could do things in Excel spreadsheets. You could even use things like Microsoft Forms to gather data where you can then extract it in Excel, manipulate it and get it into Modes. And that was another lesson of our project. We actually didn't do very much in our existing database. We didn't have time to upgrade it. We would like to one day, but we layered another system on top of it and imported the data back into our database. So we did rapid data capture outside the database. There were big risks around that in terms of synchronizing the data, but for us, it was the only way. A complete system upgrade would have taken far too long and been quite expensive. So we were able to layer another technology on top.
Thanks, Jack. And then we have this final one, and I'm going to bring Lauren in on a different point. But you said about getting to 50% of objects digitized. Is that the optimum percentage, or would you go further?
It's actually, so 50% online with an image is what we're aiming for. Yes, we would like to go further. It's imaging them is actually easy comparatively. It's getting the data that sits around them that is the time consuming and slow bit, because that's where you need curators to tell you what the object is. And they may have to go away and look up things to be able to discern that depending on when it came in. Our best resolved object was the one that had been a mystery for over 100 years. It had entered the Science Museum after the Great Exhibition, and until our assistant curator was able to tie up the details of where it had come from, we didn't know what it was. So resolving 150-year-old mysteries makes a great PR story, but it's quite slow work, and that's what stops us doing more. But also, this wasn't all of our collection. There's stuff across our northern museums as well, and there were things that are already at the National Collection Centre. So absolutely, we want to get more online. Imaging it is often the easy bit.
Yeah, as people keep saying, it's how we use it as much as how much you can get online. This next question from Nathan, Lauren, I think you can speak to. So we move at the speed of trust really struck a chord. Do you have any advice or specific examples of how best to gain buy-in from colleagues when initiating digital change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a huge advocate of working out loud or showcasing and narrating the work while it is happening, which is very, it requires a lot of vulnerability because you're going to have to be able to say, I don't know the answers, or this is something that is very much in progress. So one of the things that I've had tremendous success as a practitioner and leader, as well as working with cultural and heritage organizations through their own transformation and maturity efforts, is having a Work Out Loud Wednesday, where you are informing either, depending upon the size of your organization, it might be the entire organization, it might be several different individuals or groups, departments, where you're saying, here's what we've been working on. in the last week. Here are some of the challenges and obstacles that we've been facing. To help us get our work done, we've been working with Adam, huge shout out to Adam for helping us, answer this particular questions. We've got some kudos, shout outs in there, showing that the work is not just individual. And here's what we foresee happening in the next 1 or 2 weeks. And so really being clear about what's happening, I've used intranets or digital workplaces as a wonderful way to navigate change, navigate complexity in organizations, and really help balance out the various power dynamics. So giving, really short updates, making sure that, people have access to, well, very quick formula, when did we, decide this? Why and how is something being used, when it's being used, when that contract is up, giving some details around the complexity. So that work out loud, that showcasing of work, if every individual or group or department is doing that, you start to see the different skills, both direct and adjacent, that are being applied. You can start to see the progress of an effort. Also, having either bi-weekly or at least monthly reviews and retrospectives where you're inviting in, you're soliciting feedback is going to be key in your progress. And that means you as the leader or your leaders need to show up and be a part of those efforts, and really think critically. So that would be a couple of different things to keep in mind as part of the CALM approach.
Interesting to hear as well from you, Jack. How did you get that buy-in from colleagues for that change? I felt like you explained a bit of it, getting the strategy signed off, proving the worth, getting all those almost bureaucratic things in place. But how about the hearts and minds and how you get that momentum up as well?
Yeah, so it started off with then having done that strategy, actually going back to the teams and saying, so here's what we're signing up to do, and how can you play your part in that? Here's the project, as I gave the example of the photography, here's what we want to achieve, getting this stuff photographed really quickly. And then they owned that. I didn't come up with that technical solution. I'm not a photographer. And, they came up with the kit they needed. They worked out the workflows, that sort of thing. So some of it was coming up as well as coming down, and then some of it was about bringing together the right set of people. So around layering on the system we used for rapid data capture onto the existing system, that is quite technical. So we brought in an external IT consultant who had experience in doing that kind of thing to drive that project. But then it absolutely had to involve different people, from people who were on the data technical side through to the people who would actually be leading the teams on the ground to check that it was going to work. And it was quite a iterative process, as the best things usually are. We had to work through things we hadn't foreseen as well. There's always things you haven't foreseen, and solve them as we went along.
And that seems quite driven by the approach you and probably other leaders in the Science Museum have taken. Have you seen any of Lauren's calm approach in leadership at the Science Museum, if you're allowed to say? Or maybe you've seen it in practice, which bits really jumped out at you from what she was saying?
Yeah, lots of what Lauren's talking about really rings true. I think we've all mentioned curiosity as something that's important. And talked about visualizing data, that's important. Lots of our leaders are visual thinkers, so that meant, when I was presenting those slides to them, I was trying to take a very dry subject of doing something quite technical to do with the detail, but make it in a way they could easily understand and that would appeal to them. So we have seen a shift. The pandemic's accelerated it. Everyone's now very, very aware of the potential of digital. It's up there as one of the top pillars in our group strategy as well. So needless to say, individuals are more or less digital leaders themselves, but overall, over time, I think it has had an effect.
And Lauren, have you seen anywhere, if you're allowed to say under confidentiality, anywhere you've seen Calm implemented in practice and the kind of effect it's had in the place?
Yeah, so Calm was actively tested in the first 2 iterations of the 1x1 project. So I was embedded at the National Army Museum and the Museum of London for 18 months. And we actively used the Calm approach. And, you know, there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of abrasion, I think, at first, you know, to how to work out loud, how to narrate the work. But it also helped kind of tamper down the confusion, or, you know, move beyond those cooperative efforts to really rally around a shared goal or activity. The first iteration of the contest at the National Army Museum was about how the entire organization could really rally around and support the Chelsea History Festival. It required more than just the 2 individuals that were, you know, pulling it all together. And so how could this process, which starts 10 months before the actual festival, how could they work out loud and ensure that every member of the organization either was feeding in or was bringing in an outside perspective, or aware and advocating for the festival? Same thing with the Museum of London. Those digital roles and responsibilities were scattered across the organization. And prior to the effort, they didn't really have a common language or a common area in which to discuss what was happening and why it was happening. And so this was, you know, they used Microsoft Teams to really showcase their work in a live setting. And like I said, you know, a lot of tension, I think, at first, and probably ongoing tension, but that tension started to surface those fears and behaviors that were already existing, but amplifying a more siloed approach, whereas the Calm framework was allowing for more critical thinking, maybe slowing down and asking, is this the right pace that, you know, of change? You know, are we all in agreement that this is the purpose or the progress that we're driving towards? And I think those conversations are really healthy. And we tested those concepts as well at the Smithsonian across 5 different units in the Smithsonian Institution. And we found very similar results there as well.
I love that term, creative abrasion, because it can get very abrasive. But actually, I don't know whether I've just worked in nice places, but actually, a lot of people working in heritage of all types are often very nice. And I think that's often what leads to doing too much. Sorry, same internet connection is unstable. So sorry if I jitter out. On top of that, actually, it's a good chance to ask, I mean, you've spoken about many compelling reasons why Calm approach is the right one for leaders, but I'd also be interested in hearing what you see as the risks of leaders not taking this approach. So like then you just mentioned, it's making silos worse. But what do you think will be the result if leaders don't take this change in behavior?
There are several different things. So communication and collaboration at the end of the day is what is going to make or break any digital activity. And if you aren't embracing this Calm approach, what you could happen, which I'm tongue-tied today. What could happen is everybody is creating their own little thing in their silo. And I show up with, you know, a product that's a circle, and you show up with a product that's a square. They don't fit. So it's finding different ways in which we move beyond that passive participation in a project, and we're more active in and embracing our changing roles, that clarification of roles, understanding that digital permeates across the organization. if you are continuing to do digital projects in a silo, just because you think it's technically great, or, you know, without asking, is this actually needed? Does this fulfill a challenge or desire? What are the unintended and intended consequences? You will be, or not even having the conversation about what done or success looks like, you will be spending a lot of time, effort, resources on something that doesn't have the type of scale or impact that you want to achieve. What I do is digital by stealth. You know, I am actually doing a lot of facilitation and engaging of organizational design and development thoughts, ideas, and processes that are enhanced and enabled through digital means. And we have to think that digital is not just something that sits in one role or responsibility. It is something that is at least shared or impacts everybody in our organization, our communities overall. So we have to ask some critical questions, or we will keep having the same results over and over and over again.
I think you can go even further than that and just say, if you don't have a shared purpose, then you're unlikely to succeed. You know, you might have some small results in bits of your organization, but you won't achieve that impact at scale or transformational or with legacy benefits. It will just sit in its little silos and potentially be overlooked as a result. You know, some of what we've done has been able to amplify areas of work that we wouldn't have addressed otherwise, or has made visible bits of our collection that we wouldn't have stopped and thought about otherwise. And that's all valuable as well.
And I would just add on to that as well and say, one of the things that I find, and more so in cultural organizations than my experience in the private sector, is we get funding, you know, to do these really interesting projects or partnerships. And once that funding goes away, boom, everything fizzles out, right? And so thinking through what impact that digital change or interaction is having, and communicating and collaborating with folks, letting them know what is happening, why it's happening. We can transfer those skills, we can transfer that knowledge so that it has a life beyond that initial funding, or making the case for maintenance, for sustaining that particular effort. You know, so many times I, go into a conference and everybody shares these wonderful things, but then if you ask, is this still active? What did you learn? How did this integrate into your decision-making process? There's not a lot there in a lot of cases.
That was really key for me, was that there was a legacy to the investment that we were making. Now every object has a barcode, then we can start to extend that to our business as usual core processes, and have done and have been able to make the case for the relatively marginal investment after that. Having done that first really big infrastructure step, then you can build on that and mainstream it. And that's not to say we've got there, we've made everything brilliant and witty and so on. We haven't. It's still an ongoing journey. But that's an important message as well. With I think with digital, you have to keep renewing it. You have to keep renewing physical infrastructure as well, but digital is noughts and ones, so it's on and off. And so unlike the roof, which will gradually deteriorate, it will suddenly go if you don't keep investing in it. Suddenly the software will no longer be supported or something. So it's that, but that also did influence our choice of technologies. People said to me, why aren't you using RFID tags? And well, barcodes have been around for 30 or 40 years. If printed in the right inks, on the right kind of labels with the right adhesive, they can still be, I could be pretty confident they'll be readable, whatever the technology is like in 20 years, say. Will RFID still be around in 20 years? It might, but we went for a lower tech solution because we were interested in it having that sustainability longer term.
Very often we're telling people that they shouldn't be looking at digital projects and think they're a good idea. They should be checking, is it feasible, viable, desirable, and using some sort of test to not just try and do everything all at once. Sorry as well, my internet just cut out, which is a brilliant digital infrastructure point of my broadband being absolutely terrible. Thank you for keeping it going without me. I did actually have a question, because I think some people can get a little bit dispirited in the challenge of some of this. It is a change in a way of working. It is a change in grasping the opportunities as well as the challenges. How do you maintain your curiosity, and how do you keep persevering in what is quite an uncertain process at times, even if it's very collaborative and very fun? And maybe that's how you keep that curiosity, but how do you keep yourself up, keep yourself going? So I'm not talking about how you just not signing off from stress, but how do you maintain your enthusiasm and curiosity?
Yeah, Lauren will probably have a brilliant theory for how you should do this. I mean, I think it's the being mindful bit partly is, be kind. We had a situation, a colleague was very, very stressed about something to do with one element of the project, and wrote an email late at night, which was not a good sign. And I was actually there was an issue which totally needed sorting, but at that point I was more concerned about him, and that he shouldn't have been writing emails at that time of night. He shouldn't have been thinking about work at that time of night. So that's one thing, is how can you remember we're all people? How can we get back on the same page about whatever we're doing? And then the rest of it, I think, is just having the vision and the goal in mind. And okay, you might have to jettison bits of what you hope to achieve along the way. That's the case with almost all projects. It's like if you do an exhibition project, then there will be something that drops out on grounds of budget, or because someone would lend it to you or something, or it won't fit in the building, and you just have to let go. So there will always be bits that are less than ideal, but provided you've got this is what we absolutely must deliver, in that kind of Moscow thing, then you just focus on that and go, okay, shame about whatever, or sigh, it's going to cost slightly more than we thought. Do I need to ask for more money from somewhere? But still maintain the focus on what were you trying to achieve, and also problems shared are problems halved. What could we collectively come up with? What ideas might the team have that I haven't got?
Interesting you mentioned Moscow analysis, because in a recent project it was exactly the role of the leader in that project. The executive leader was to come in and say, yeah, but must that happen? If we don't do this thing, do the lights turn off? Is it assured? Like, you all love this idea, but if we don't do it, does the project collapse in on itself? So you don't necessarily need to know all these technical details. As long as saying is just asking the right questions and doing that prodding and getting that abrasion. Sorry, Lauren, the same question for you.
Yeah, I start and end my day by either reading or listening to other voices, perspectives, sectors. I am a voracious reader. And I love dystopian and science fiction. And I think more people should read those types of books, not just be in nonfiction mode. And I am constantly imagining myself and the organizations that I'm working with and for in those multiple futures. How would I or an organization react? What would help us prevent, this consequence? How might we think, about those more positive consequences? How do we imagine these multiple futures together? And so I'm constantly looking outside of the sector or my discipline for inspiration. So I usually pick a theme every single year, and that's kind of what I, delve deeper into. And that's what keeps me curious. I also think out loud. I work out loud. I practice what I preach, not just with, the organization. So I'll communicate when I'm really stuck. Or I love, working through my thoughts, through podcast format, having a conversation and making sure that people, understand that, somebody can say, I really don't know. I'm exploring. And this is what we're finding. Or does anybody have a different perspective? I think it's really healthy.
I really agree with looking outside our sectors as well. I've talk to people in completely unrelated sectors, but actually what you find is the leadership challenges are very, very similar. How even if the purpose is different, even if they're in a commercial business, they will face a lot of the same challenges, and they may have thought of things that we haven't thought of.
We are now at 25 past, so on those two very useful notes, we'll end it there. But thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Lauren, for your really enjoyable, it was a really useful talks. They will be shared afterwards as recordings. And to remind you, there are 3 remaining Leading the Sector online seminars in this series. So there will be one on inclusion, equity, and digital. There'll be one on digital enterprise and heritage, which is already scheduled for 25th of July, but the booking isn't yet live. And there'll be one on heritage, digital, and the climate crisis. So how digital is involved in all of those, and how we can help you with each of those themes. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Culture 24 and the National Lottery Heritage Funds. And please let us know what you thought on Twitter, and we'll speak to you soon.